Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Philosophossum, and I've been debating libertarianism with people for quite a while at this point. I've uploaded my first video in November of 2019, so that puts my channel at a little over a year old at this point. But even before I began YouTubing, I would often debate people on different forums such as Telegram or Reddit. And in all the time I've spent doing this, one thing that I've learned is that most of the people who criticize libertarianism don't actually know what it is. Now of course that's not to say that everyone who criticizes libertarianism doesn't understand what it is. There are people out there who do understand libertarianism and do offer legitimate criticism. I'm not necessarily trying to hand-wave that away, but from my experience when I've debated libertarianism with someone, their arguments would be based on some sort of misconception of what libertarians actually believe. And I don't think anyone exemplifies this more than Thom Hartmann. I mean, every single time this guy opens his mouth about libertarianism, he just makes it abundantly clear that he doesn't know the first thing about it. As a matter of fact, that's actually a bit of an understatement. Like, I don't think there's words you can use to describe how little this man understands libertarianism. Like, if you were to drop a nuclear bomb on libertarianism, Thom Hartmann's understanding of it wouldn't receive a single dose of radiation. So the video we're looking at here is a short one, it's just under 3 minutes, but I think it beautifully exemplifies not only how little Thom Hartmann understands about libertarianism, but also how terrible he is at formulating substantive criticisms. And of course nothing says I want my content to be taken seriously like starting your video title with a freaking hashtag, like you're a teenager on Instagram or some shit.
We're primates. 3.5 million years of evolution since we split from chimpanzees have primed us for this. And then you look at the Libertarian Party.
So this is a very classic example of the appeal to nature fallacy. Well, evolution has primed our society to work this particular way, but then along comes libertarianism trying to challenge the natural way of things. If anything, libertarianism is more in line with evolution, because one of the big reasons that human society has reached a level of flourishing that no other species has ever experienced is our ability to meet our needs by cooperating and working together as opposed to fighting and taking each other's shit.
And the Libertarian Party, and to a large extent the Republican Party as well, but the Libertarian Party is like the most toxic influence in the Republican Party.
Hey pal, you just blowing from Stupid Town?
Well, first of all, nice poisoning the well there. Second of all, that's a very strange thing for a progressive to say, considering that libertarians actually agree with progressives on more issues than they do with conservatives. I mean, would you honestly look me straight in the face and tell me that the party that advocates for gay marriage, abortion rights, and legalizing drugs is the most toxic influence on the Republican Party? Like, I always knew this guy's head was up his ass, but gee, I didn't think it was this bad.
This is their contemporary platform. This is from June 2014. They haven't yet adopted their new platform. As libertarians, we seek a world of liberty, a world in which all individuals are sovereign over their own lives, and no one is forced to sacrifice for the benefit of others.
So in other words, they want a world without slavery. Don't see what the problem is there.
You get this?
Yeah, I get it. They said that nobody should be forced to sacrifice for the benefit of others, which is vastly different from arguing that people shouldn't or wouldn't. And of course, like every other extreme leftist out there, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that you're going to dishonestly conflate these concepts so as to create a version of libertarianism that's easier to attack.
Now, in 1980, the Libertarian Party platform didn't have such flowery language as the 2014 one. In 2014, they're basically trying to make it palatable to millennials by making a language sufficiently complex and flowery that it sounds fabulous. 'Cause the pot came cold, the kettle black.
Yeah, the left never does this. The left never uses flowery and obscure language to try and reel in millennials to their ideology. You never hear left-wing politicians promising people free college, free health care, higher minimum wage. Don't worry about where that money's going to come from.
We realize that our planet's climate is constantly changing, but environmental advocates and social pressure are the most effective means of changing public behavior.
This is true, actually. There's a multitude of effective ways of addressing environmental issues through the marketplace. Probably the biggest one I can think of off the top of my head is simply just the market's natural tendency to encourage efficient resource consumption. Because businesses save money if they use less resources, and the market encourages businesses to keep their operating costs low so they make more money, this has a side benefit of encouraging environmental stewardship. On top of that, there's also environmental nonprofits and advocacy groups, where people who are legitimately concerned about the environment and aren't just seeking political power actually go out and do things to help improve the environment, whether that be picking up trash, planting trees, whatever the case may be. See, a lot of good can be accomplished through volunteer work. You see, Thom Hartmann, or the left wing in general, make a lot of these arguments that are predicated upon the idea that people are greedy and selfish and don't care about social issues, which is why they won't do anything good for the community unless the government forces them to, and that's provably not the case.
In other words, government shouldn't do anything about this.
I'm not sure where you got that from, Tom. He never said that the government shouldn't do anything about this. All they said was that environmental advocacy and social pressure are the best way of changing people's behavior. They didn't say anything about the government being or not being involved in this. I mean, who's to say that the government can't employ those strategies of environmental advocacy and social pressure to try and change behavior?
Energy and resources. We oppose all government control of energy pricing, allocation, and production.
In other words, they're against central planning of the economy, which is a good thing, which makes sense. I mean, central planning never works. Like, anytime it's been attempted, it's failed. Like, anytime the government tries to centrally plan or control some aspect of the economy, whether it be the quantity of resources produced or the price that those resources are sold at, it never ends well. This is for two reasons. The first reason is that the government doesn't operate on market signals, it just takes the money it needs. Because of this, the government is more or less blind to any sort of information about supply and demand. There's no way for the government to know what the optimal quantity or price for a particular resource is. The second problem is that even if the government did have some kind of mechanism that enabled them to take this information into account, economies are just so vast and complicated that it would be overwhelming for one single organization to try and manage all of that. Now, for one resource, this may not necessarily be such a problem, but you have to remember that hardcore liberals like Thom Hartmann want the government to literally do everything for us.
Oh, yeah, no, we may have an energy crisis. This is not the government.
You realize that whenever we do have an energy crisis, more often than not, it's caused by government. The biggest example I can think of is the massive oil embargo back in the 70s. Basically, a bunch of oil exporting countries in the Middle East decided to embargo the United States in retaliation for military aggression over there. If you want to prevent an energy crisis from happening, what you need to do is encourage efficient consumption of energy. And this goes back to a point that I mentioned before. One of the reasons the market is good at what it's doing is because it encourages efficient resource consumption. If a resource is in high demand but in short supply, that will increase the cost of it, which will encourage people to either use less of that resource or find an alternative. This is why government subsidies of fossil fuels are so problematic, because not only are they encouraging inefficient use of resources that are in limited supply, once you burn up all the oil it's gone, but it's also stalling development of renewable alternatives like solar and wind.
We're not all in this together.
So this is what's known as a gish gallop, which is basically a strategy of argumentation in which you throw out a bunch of points in rapid succession, as opposed to carefully formulating your arguments one at a time. And this is very clearly what he's doing here. It's very easy to notice how he's just jumping between points without offering any sort of elaboration. Like, he just rapidly jumps between energy crisis, the government shouldn't be involved, we're not all in this together. This sort of strategy of argumentation is intended to accomplish two things. First, it's intended to overwhelm the opponent. When you're just rapidly throwing arguments at the wall, this makes it difficult for anyone arguing against you to address all of them. So if your opponent ends up not being able to argue against everything that you had to say, you can make it out to be as if they had no way of arguing against it, as opposed to they simply couldn't get around to it. The second thing this strategy is intended to do is to avoid having to elaborate on your arguments. You may have noticed that Thom Hartmann here isn't offering much in terms of an explanation to back up the claims he's making, and that's actually a key element to this strategy. When you're just rapidly throwing arguments at the wall like this, you can actually make your position seem stronger than it really is without putting that much substance into it.
We favor free market banking.
Yes, absolutely. We need free market banking. The current Federal Reserve System we have just churns out a bunch of fiat currency and debt. As a matter of fact, I'd go a step further. We don't just need free market banking, we need a free market whole financial system. Everything down to the currency should be privatized. And to all you people watching this saying that can't be done, actually it has been done. Not only does Bitcoin retain its value way better than any national currency, but its value keeps increasing.
With unrestricted competition, no rules.
No. Unrestricted competition just means that there's no red tape to prevent people from starting their own bank and entering into the marketplace. It doesn't mean that banks just get to do whatever the hell they want on a whim.
Labor markets, employment and compensation agreements between private employers and employees are outside the scope of government. This is from the Contemporary.
So what? You're not going to try and offer any sort of rebuttal to that? I mean, if you're trying to convince us that the Libertarian Party platform is wrong, or at least flawed in some way, we're going to kind of need an explanation as to why it's wrong. You can't just read off points from their platform and just expect us to take for granted that it's wrong. Because what they said there actually makes a lot of sense to me. You know, agreements between employees and employers are between employees and employers. It's not really any of the business of the government. Now, if something regarding this agreement were to go wrong and the government would need to step in and adjudicate it, you know, that would make sense. But having the government butt in and actively interfere with the arrangement just doesn't make sense. Anytime this does happen, the government steps in and tries to meddle around with the arrangement. Usually bad things happen. Like minimum wage laws and mandatory benefits laws actually make it harder to hire people, which ends up reducing the number of jobs available. And for those instances where employers are legitimately mistreating or abusing their workers, well, historically, private sector unions have done a pretty good job of stepping in and taking care of that.
Education is best provided by the free market. In other words, no more government schools. Shut down all those public schools.
Nobody's calling for the shutdown of all public schools everywhere across the country. We just want to either privatize them or find some way to fund them voluntarily. Like, I'm not necessarily against the idea of there being public schools as an option for poorer people who can't afford a private education. As a matter of fact, when public schools were first founded in this country, that's actually what their main intention was, as an alternative option for poorer people who can't afford private education. They weren't intended to be the main form of education for most students. In the description, you'll find a link to a video by FreedomToon which discusses this concept further.
We favor a free market healthcare system.
You know, I would love that. I would love being able to decide what to pay for in my health insurance policy instead of some bureaucrat somewhere making that decision for me.
No more Medicaid, no more Medicare.
So having a free market for healthcare doesn't necessarily mean that there wouldn't be charity or other programs in place to help people who can't afford healthcare who need it. As a matter of fact, back when there was an actual free market for healthcare, there was something called mutual aid societies, which actually did a pretty good job of making healthcare not only accessible but affordable for working class people. There are also charity doctors who would work at homeless shelters to try and treat sick people who couldn't afford treatment. Once again, there will be a video linked in the description. I'll explain these concepts further.
No more Obamacare.
You're using that as a point against free market healthcare? As far as I'm concerned, getting rid of Obamacare is a fucking selling point. Like, nobody likes Obamacare. Nobody. Even hardcore advocates of UHC and socialized medicine turn their nose up at it. And it's obvious why. It's basically one big kiss on the ass to big corporate insurance companies. Like, it literally forces you to buy their service whether you want it or not.
Retirement planning is the responsibility of the individual, not the government. Libertarians would phase out the current government-sponsored Social Security system and transition to a private voluntary system.
And once again, he's not going to bother explaining why this is a problem. I mean, a voluntary system that you agree to instead of being forced into. A system where you have the right to choose what retirement plan you think works best for you instead of having someone else force one down your throat. I mean, what a ridiculous and absurd concept, am I right? I mean, there's actually a lot of issues with Social Security. It would take me a while to methodically go through and actually discuss all of them, so most likely I'll hold that off for another video. But I'd say the biggest problem with Social Security, and it's a problem that no private IRA or annuity has, is that it's unsustainable. It requires more money going in than it does paying out, which means you're just kicking that debt can further and further down the road.
This is sociopathic.
Well, there he goes, using big, scary-sounding words to try and make something seem bad without having to actually argue against it, which is just another typical thing people do when they have nothing of substance to actually say. If you actually know what libertarianism is, not Thom Hartmann's fake strawman version of libertarianism, but actual libertarianism, it's all about respecting one another's rights and peaceful coexistence. It's probably actually one of the least sociopathic things there is.
This is Ayn Rand saying, as we played last week for you, you know, when I die, it's not that I've died, the world ends. This is putting oneself right at the center of the planet.
This is the hardest home I've ever had to sell, but here you go, Mr. Joel. Here are the keys to your new glass house.
Thanks. You know, I didn't want to buy this, but you really wore me down.
Just don't throw any stones.
So this has to be like one of the most blatant and obvious examples of projection I've ever seen in the entire time I've been doing this on YouTube. Thom Hartmann basically summarized his entire political position. You know, the world revolves around me, everyone in the entire world should be forced to bow down to my whims. He tried making the claim that that's what libertarianism is. Yeah, libertarians are the sociopaths, not the people who advocate that men with guns be sent to your house to kidnap you into a cage if you don't pay for our education or healthcare or whatever we decide.
And it's the opposite of what human societies need. We need more tribes.
So you'll recall earlier in the video, Thom Hartmann made the accusation that libertarians tend to use flowery and vague sounding rhetoric to try and push our positions. Fittingly enough, he ends his video doing just that. We need more tribe, which is basically a shorthand way of saying that libertarians are too concerned with individualism and don't care about the community at large, which is a long debunked myth.
It's an urban legend that never happened.
So there's this very common myth that because libertarians believe in individual rights, that somehow makes them individualistic, that we're somehow against people forming collectives or communities or whatever, and that's not true at all. Of course we believe in people coming together in communities. I mean, humans are social species after all. No man is an island, and of course living in a society amongst other people comes with benefits that you don't get when you're just out fending for yourself. I get that. See, we're not against any and all social interaction whatsoever, we're against forced interactions. It's not that we think people should be hyper-insular or not interact with anybody, it's that we would just prefer that all associations be voluntary. And I think that was the main point of this video. He was trying to get across the idea that libertarians are super individualistic and don't care about the community. As a matter of fact, I'm not entirely sure what the whole point of this video was. I mean, he's not actually really making any substantive points, he's just kind of gish-galloping around. I mean, half the time he wasn't even making arguments, he was just reading off the Libertarian Party platform. I mean, part of the reason my response is so long in relation to the original video is just because there's so little substance, I have to actually go in and add substance. And like I said in previous videos, if you're not actually going to put in the effort to make substantive arguments, you're really just wasting your time. Like, I really don't get what the goal of this video was here. He wasn't really making any substantive points. This was basically just 3 minutes of Thom Hartmann's and subsequently the audience's time down the drain. Anyways, this has been Philosophossum making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.